This is a current rendering to see how our creature looks like at the moment. And I think the biggest issues are still on the tail and the missing body fur. So what I want to do is to bring this in a more natural pose with the tail down. To do that, we have to transplant the fur onto the geometry. But first we're going to clean up the tail structure of the SOP level. And here we're going to copy over the leg groom. This is what I want to use for the tail. And we will just connect the tail guides to the groom. You can delete this geometry here. Just rename that to tail groom, because this will be our fur system. Let's dive right into the guides. And here we can increase the density a little bit more than we would do usually, because you don't want to see the skin. You basically want to have enough density to get enough coverage there. Deleted previously. I will bring this all into like a better structure to have a better overview when I'm going to simulate this creature. Just checking if my guides are producing the right attributes. And here we can see that no hair is being generated. So we want to get rid of all of that. And we can even get rid of that too, except for the skin. And then we can just paste over what we had in the guide SOP. So I want a clear definition of different approaches, so you can do stuff in Houdini. But yeah, this is probably the most forward one if you want to go with the main structure that Houdini uses for simulating. And I will rewire it to the new skin, and this should hopefully look as similar as possible to the version you had in the guide SOP. If that looks any different, you might have to debug and see where the issue is. But this looks about right, so I will keep it in this structure. So here we are going to copy over the neck guides and groom for the body parts. And here we can delete some stuff and reset the strokes. And then we can begin to place some guides. Just have a look into your references and try to match directionality as close as possible. We'll also display the tail to see how that looks like with the shapes included. Now we have to define the density map or the region map for our body. And for that, I'm going to read in the tail attribute. So I'm going to create a output node that I can import via object merge into my skin and use that as a multiply for the region later on. And I think it will be just a multiply in order to get the shape that we want that is dependent on the other regions as well. So first thing, let's get the tail. So we're going to define that in the attribute wrangle. And first we're going to start by 1 in order to assign everything a value of 1. And then I think it will be much safer to just multiply instead of subtracting. Otherwise you might, if there are overlapping regions, for example, you might end up with negative values or wrong values. So I don't want that necessarily. And I can see that the tail is inverted. So I'm going to run a few tests to see what's going on. And yeah, you can see that everything is inverted. Basically, we're at the opposite of what we need for the evaluation. So I will just write a fit function and invert the region neck and the other regions that way. It is gold. And see if that works. And we can see the tail is not we have to include the face as well. So let's just multiply that with the face as well. Let's make double sure it's showing up at the end of the tree diagram. And add a density attribute as well. So it's showing up in the list. And here as well. Perfect. Let's go back to the body groom, and here we can add our attribute and see if that evaluates correctly. And we end up with something very weird looking. So we have to debug that and see what's going on. And it looks like there's a length node somewhere that is picking up the active area, which we don't necessarily want there, or not in that intensity that we see here. And build my output nodes here and rename them to the body outputs. Let's go back to the body. It's still showing up incorrectly. So we have to debug that a little bit further. So I will make a direct connection here and get rid of these caches. It's going in the right direction. There's still the length node that is bound to the active area that is causing issues, I think. And wait for the guides to evaluate. And here we can see that the density attribute is still set to active area. So we have to disable the length node and put that to the density of the body. It looks correct, so I will just go on with the guides at the moment. You can see that I did a screenshot of a rendering on the top left where I painted in the shapes that I want to improve. And so basically I want to fill all those gaps with guide curves. And this is the new version, the newest version of a rendering. And you can see it's much more filled up. But yeah, some of the directionalities are not as good as they could be. So here, what I'm trying to do is I am trying to create like a middle guide system based on my painted guides, and I will create guides with more resolution there. And then I can sculpt onto these guides and feed these into the official system. So that way we can get more resolution and like a nicer interpolated look. It will be more difficult to control because you have way more guides, but sometimes that's very helpful. So here I will create a hair generate node. You can see that it's very small and there are like multiple hairs growing from the same strands. So we have to increase the influence radius by a lot in order to get the right distribution here. We can go middle system guides, we can go higher on the width in order to see everything in a better way. We'll also lower the density more, and I think we can even go lower. Getting with the extrude and blend setting, but it gets extremely straggly here. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to smooth out these shapes so we have a cleaner interpolation. Here I also put a skylight into my scene in order to visualize my hair system better. So we will dive into the hair groom. Here you can see a representation of the shader, like a very simple representation, and that can be helpful when you're trying to work on the clumps, for example. So here we will have a closer look into the clump settings. And it's a very nice way to visualize groom and shading. It can be slow from time to time and very dependent on your GPU. Work on hairstyles and doesn't get too slow usually. So here we are going to create a randomize band based on the company. Comes to clumping, I prefer the curl node, and if that is not enough for your groom, I will make the extra step and create a separate bend node. So it's better to keep everything in one node if you can manage. Otherwise, try to avoid it to use too many nodes. Clumping looks very monotone, so it's like very repetitive. So what would be nice to have is like a clump map, or anything like that, where you have like a few regions where it's more clumped versus a few regions where it's less clumped. So in order to create that map, you can just add it to the list here, just call it clump size. Send it a default value of 0.5. Then you can add it to your paint nodes and just deal with it like with any other map or attribute. And it seems like I have to reset my viewport again. Here I can finally paint onto it. Make sure to tap into the right attribute here. Now we're going to paint. I want the regions on the extremity